A future for stars. Since the 2016 public sale, stars have served as the primary investment vehicle for people coming into Urbit. Monetarily, in terms of total address space held, they're not the majority stakeholder because of the galaxies right now. Not to set up like a star galaxy competition here, but there are about 2,500 star holding addresses today, and about 110 individual galaxy holders across everything. So stars represent a huge investment. It's a human, I would say human scale. It's in a sense maybe a middle class investment in Urbit, right? It's the ability to buy into the network, right? But it's attainable by someone without venture capital or some other source to get involved. So stars have served as a really good signal that you have a dog in the fight of whether or not Urbit wins in a way that planets, moons, comets cannot do. Star bounties and sales have been very important in terms of fueling network growth and network development. They've been the primary vehicle that Urbit Foundation has been using to invest in and encourage development on Urbit. They partook of the Web3 NFT craze, but were not wholly part of it. In a sense, there were benefits that accrued from this, but pattern matching too hard as an NFT, I think, has also hurt the star market in the medium term. Unfortunately, and this is what I intend to address today in my talk, stars have rather become the middle children of Mars. They occupy kind of an uncomfortable place where their original value proposition that was made for stars, which was to sell planets, has possibly collapsed in the short to medium term due to hosting competition. And other value propositions, like the UKBAR transaction validator proposition that was put forward, have not materialized in a form that is directly useful to us. So we're in an interesting place where the value propositions of stars all seem to be latent. They aren't visible to us right now, and to some extent we have to figure out what these are and how we get to these. Now, as a fair warning, the first half of my talk is kind of scary. It's probably not going to feel good, but I think that we can solve these problems, and like everything else in Urbit, you only solve it if you actually start working on it, you start thinking about it, you start building for that future that you're trying to bring into being. So it's hard to overstate the disaster that star valuation going to zero would be for Urbit, seeing as how it is the majoritarian investment vehicle that people have used to signal that they are invested in Urbit as a platform. So we're gonna engage this directly and see what we can figure out in terms of what we're trying to build. Stars are nominally, they've been intended to play three roles in the Urbit ecosystem. They have been address space holders, so they've been planet distributors. Sorry, that's the scary slide I didn't want to get to quite yet. They will be packet routers, and then there's a provision for them to serve as some sort of stellar congress. The model of stars as address space allocators has served as probably the primary motivator for investment in stars in Urbit to date. There's a simple calculation that can be done where you say if planets have X value, then stars have 65,536 times X value. Well, I'm counting the star itself in that value, but yes. You're checking my math, good. Since Urbit doesn't really have the equivalent of stock, this is how you invest in the network. You buy address space. I always explain this to my folks. Like, it's sort of like if I owned every .com address that started with DA. What would that be worth to you? And they're like, I can't think of any addresses that I go to that start with DA regularly. But, so how much the block of address space you own should be worth is an open question. It's something we're going to address subsequently. Stars have also been planned to be the peer discovery and primary network routing mechanism on Urbit. Right now that role is played by galaxies, and then once you have peer discovery, you can do point-to-point communication directly. You don't have to worry as much about it. And to my knowledge, there is not really any significant pressure on the network at its current scale to shift from galaxy routing to star routing. Star routing will become necessary at some point. I've heard various estimates tossed around of, maybe it's 10,000 before we switch off of routing everything through galaxies, 10,000 per galaxy, something like that. we don't know exactly what the network congestion dynamics would look like, and it would depend on a lot of factors. But at some point, there will be a need to do this in AIMS, to route things through stars as well. And then the Stellar Congress proposal is an interesting one because stars have been tapped to provide non-technical network governance. There's an interesting hole right in the middle of the urbit interim constitution, which is to actually say, what does non-technical interim governance of a technical protocol look like? Like what does that actually mean? And the fact that we haven't answered that is a clue that it either doesn't mean much or it doesn't mean anything pressing, given the dynamics on the network that we currently have with the Galaxy appointing the board and the director of the Urbit Foundation, and then moving from there. It could include things like how censures or reputation integrate into the network and how these work. But anyway, the real problem as of summer 2023 is that all star value is an implicit bet on the future. And there's not really a clear network-based incentive for people to actually run stars rather than hodling them and continuing to take that bet. Since they're not critical to network performance, this isn't an unmitigated disaster, right? It's not a huge problem because we can run things through galaxies. But it's analogous to, in the medium to long term, expecting Bitcoin miners to mine without incentives. And that's not a situation that makes any sense. So this is what I'm going to deal with today. This is what we're going to talk about. The market value of a star it's a bet. It's essentially, we can treat this as a prediction market on the extractable value of a star. If you examine, this is from the Dune dashboard, which is a very good resource, which was put out recently. You can see that the trend is for stars to have a floor in the 2,000 to 3,000 range recently. Now, there's problems with using this as descriptive of a market. For one thing, stars are sort of not really a market. Like, transaction volume is so low that single events and batch transactions have an outsized effect on the price. And there's also a lot of private party star transactions that do not show up in this at all. We don't know if they're higher or lower. We don't know what's going on. So we actually don't have complete information about what's going on with this. And of course, there's USD inflation. There's the fact that we pattern matched as an NFT. And so when there was an NFT craze, we behaved like an NFT. We had a similar arc for that. But I think most of us would say that, it's a buyer's market, right? It's a nice place for a buyer to be, but for a seller, we'd like this number to go up a little bit. As a starting point for our discussion, I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call the default future. The default future is what happens in the absence of any special actions taken to correct the behavior of what happens here. So it's, in other words, saying, what happens to stars and star value in the absence of taking anything. So first question is, under what circumstances does address space bear value? The market is not saturated right now. And so what I mean by that is that the number of planets and stars that are available is exceeded by the demand. Right? There's more available on the market for you to pick up one way or another than what the demand is at. And we're not at any sort of like 99.9% ratio or anything that would really drive a full commodities market. Hosting pressures have been producing a race to the bottom in terms of star prices, coupled with the effect of L2. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but I'm saying that from a star valuation standpoint, this is not good for star valuation. That's all I'm saying in that regard. So if stars cannot recoup value from address space, then their role as a planet distributor becomes, in a sense, largely ceremonial. Or you're going to build some kind of community, you're going to push things a certain way, but you're not going to accrue massive market value manifest through that mechanism. And it's too late to enforce market scarcity through lockup contracts on either stars or planets because those were set years ago in azimuth and that clock is running out. Okay, so the next question is, can packet routing lead to value? I think there's two scenarios here in which packet routing can lead to some value capture. One of them is where stars start to look something like an internet service provider, and there's some sort of perhaps expedited packet routing for extremely active points that you can pay for, or there's a microtransaction that's associated with packet routing in some way. None of the infrastructure for this really exists. It's conceivable to see how this might look, but it doesn't really exist right now. Stars could perhaps serve as a CDN or something like that, but there's not really an apparent way for 65,000 stars to also not do a frictionless race to the bottom to become a commodity market on microtransactions on packet routing as well. And you don't want to compete in a commodity market unless you're big. That's one of the rules of thumb. Okay, so the other way that you might accrue value from this would be for some entity like the Urbit Foundation to, in essence, sponsor star operation. But this is fundamentally circular, right? It would be a way of juicing the network, and this may prove to be justified in some sense in the near to medium term, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of how do you extract value from operating a star as a packet router, okay? The other role of stars was to serve in something that looks like the Stellar Congress. Well, with 2 to the 16th seats in the Stellar Congress, the marginal value of acquiring a seat in the Stellar Congress is not very important, right? Now, we'll probably get some interesting game theoretic dynamics once there are enough players in the market and you start to see factions form, but right now that's not really a near-term visible proposition here. So this leaves stars in an uncomfortable position. Urbit as a network has a fairly clear value proposition. But the more legible investment vehicle is the Galaxy right now for people. This is, I think, bad for Urbit in a sense because it's a decentralized network, or what purports to become a decentralized network, but is dominated by whales de facto in the short term. I think we're on a good trajectory for that not to be the case long term, but it's a thing to think about as we think about, like, how do we achieve decentralization instead of decentralization theater, which is the problem that plagues a lot of DAOs and DAO-shaped things. All right, at the macro level then, we have to think about how does the market for stars, any market for stars, reflect underlying value, and how do we express for and provide such value in stars? So stars as a market, we can talk about exactly what that means, but the star market is somewhat broken right now. It's hard to reach an understanding between buyers and sellers. There's a lot of friction in actual transfers, and the separate markets are moderately decoupled from each other. You can see fairly different prices if you go to OpenSea, if you go to Star.market, if you go to the Wrapped Star platform. And this is, it's a symptom that something's wrong in the dynamics of the market when you have large arbitrageable gaps like that are not actually being arbitraged to erase them. So we have decent tools for finding and locating stars for sale, but we don't yet have a really frictionless way to use them. We don't have escrow mechanisms. We don't have some of the other things that you'd like to see. We also don't have much liquidity in the market. Low liquidity is bad for 3 reasons. First off, it's difficult to realize value. Holding a star feels more like owning real estate. And there's, of course, the classic story about being land poor, right? Like you own a lot of land, like you're a rancher, but you can't do anything monetarily with it without mortgaging it or doing some sort of unfavorable financial bet to extract a dynamic valuation from that. Low liquidity also means that you don't get the arbitrage games, which would absorb the slack in the market that you're seeing between the different markets. And it also contributes to market volatility, right? As I pointed out, some of this volatility is due to single transactions or batch transactions that are moving this much more than they should, right? Like once you have a mature market, single transactions don't move the market appreciably. You have to have a lot of transactions moving one way or the other to actually see that kind of market movement. So while I like number go up as much as anyone, I'm also not going to argue purely for let's just make stars worth a lot as an investment vehicle. I think that they actually do have a I think that clear statements can be made for value creation and value capture in stars, and that's one of the things I'm going to work on throughout the rest of this talk. Let me skip ahead. We've talked about some of the market stuff, so I don't think we need to go deeper into that. Okay, so fundamentally, I talked about a market that has full saturation versus a market that has partial saturation, where if demand is much lower than supply, then this represents a downward force on your prices because it's easy to, get that buyer's market. So our conservative operating model for the future of star prices must essentially assume that stars and planets do not mint out. There are reasons they could. There's definitely an urbit maximalist standpoint that says, every cloud server on the planet is running urbit because urbit is easier to run than Nginx or Apache, and it does the things that you want out of the box. I like that. I want to aim for that future. But I think that our model should not assume that we get the fully minted out version of what star valuation looks like. So we're going to extend the star metaphor as far as it will go today. Next part of this, stellar life cycle. So the spectrum of star futures ranges between brown dwarfs and blue giants, which are up here. We can get as nerdy as we like with this, but the fundamental idea here is basically that we do have cool, less luminous points in the star history of star evolution, and then brighter, more energetic points to the upper left and upper part of this. One anchor point of this is what we'll call brown dwarfs. Brown dwarfs is essentially arguing that stars are glorified planets, and they don't really bring an additional value add over planets to the ecosystem. We're not too far from that point today in practical terms on network operation. Red dwarf, in my model here, would mean stars provide, there's an incentive to operate them sufficient that they do provide routing, planet distribution, and governance mechanisms. Yellow dwarf would be stars acting as centralizers for community coordination and curation. This has been experimented with. It has not gone mainstream yet, but I think there's reasons to believe in it. And then blue giant is stars offering a variety of unique and valuable services that are most feasible at their level of access and coordination. Okay, that's what we want to aim for. We want to say, we have stars. What would they be good at that would lead us towards the kind of future that urbiters want, right? We want a decentralized future. We want a future that has certain kinds of exit and self-definition and community self-definition available to you. How do stars work towards that end for us? Now, early urbit investment in stars was undergirt by the backstop promise of planet value. As this has somewhat exhausted, we've had to shift to thinking about other more clever ways about what stars can and cannot competitively accomplish for urban. There have been some ideas and proposals put out there around this, but functionally, that's the problem we're at. That's the problem we need to solve right now. And it's kind of it's a hard problem, right? Like we're not stuck, but we're like a little bit stuck. It's a thing we need to take into account as we work on this. So one framework of star value, this doesn't necessarily communicate to the investment world very well, but it's one I like to think of. So this message was sent from the Arecibo telescope, and it's infamous because it's supposed to communicate to extraterrestrial life things about like the structure of DNA and where we are in the solar system and stuff. But without a key, you can't figure out any of this. This is like sent in the 80s. This is like Carl Sagan's SETI era. So this is Earth. We're the third planet from the sun, but I guess now it's outdated because Pluto's no longer a planet. Anyway, it's kind of an odd one.
How do you use your time like interpreting hieroglyphics?
Well, if you gotta actually, there's an interesting book by Stanislaw Lem called His Master's Voice that is about a Manhattan project that they receive a message from an alien civilization, and they can tell that's what it is, and they set up this Manhattan project to figure out what it is. And what makes the book interesting is they fail to crack the message, and the book is about them trying to grapple with the fact that they failed to actually crack the alien message. So it's a very interesting book. Anyway, star value. So we live in a world where part of the problem with the way services run on the internet today is that we have this tripartite divide into owners, renters, and maintainers. And due to financialization and extractive practices and some of the incentives that are out there in the market, the incentives of these three groups do not line up very well. And so you have people who tend to own facilities but not use them directly so much, or maybe they incidentally use them like Google, but a lot of what they're doing is because they're using them to extract value from another class. Returns are high enough that you don't actually have to worry about maintaining them so much, and you're just trying to squeeze extractive value out of the people that use the service. This is what happens here. I'm not going full communist. I'm not going Marxist. We're okay on this. Renters then are the people who do not own the things that they receive, that they have. And so they are also incentivized not to maintain, but to extract as much value as possible from the thing that they have. And then you have this other class of maintainers. A lot of software developers and IT people fall into this category, where their job is to try to eke out the value they can in the gap between what the owners are taking and what the renters are taking, and yet still keep the lights on, right? Still keep the system running. Part of the vision of Urbit is that we can reunify these three roles in the same person, right? In the same individual. That you are owner, maintainer, and renter for what you're doing, or that the ways in which you are farming out these capabilities is legible to you rather than completely obscured by the enterprise and corporate dynamics around you. So functionally, if we use the Urbit address space correctly, then I think stars will work very hard towards realizing this unification, because there are things that stars can do in the system that are below the capacity of galaxies numerically, but above the capacity of planets based on the way that we're actually going to structure and set things up. Now, hodling stars, okay, so galaxies derive value from their role in network infrastructure and from the massive amounts of real estate that appertain to them. Planets derive value because it's yours, and you can run it, and you can do what you want to with it. Stars are currently operated or hodled. Hodling is a bet that the stars do arrive at a point of realized value. Operating a star today is, it's sort of a conspicuous consumption type of activity, right? Like, I have a star, I'm going to use it, I like it, but it's like driving a Maserati around town or something, right? Like, it's a little bit flashy. It is a flex, and I love it when someone comes in with a galaxy and like Wex posting in all caps. I mean, I appreciate that, but all right. The first Latin motto of my talk. There's only 2 Latin mottos in my talk, so we're okay there. Qui pro astris loquitur? Who speaks for the stars? One of the questions is, how should stars think of themselves? How should star owners think of themselves? Are they a class? Are they an interest group? Are they purely competitive? Like, what exactly are they today, and what should they become? And this is an interesting question because it defines the playing field on which a lot of what happens to star value will take place. There are definitely 2 critical organizational roles that stars are going to need to play. If stars are table stakes for playing on Mars, and they are, then we do need to have some form of forum or collective organization to bring everyone together. Some of you have seen that in the past few months, I've started working with Kenny on the Provider Standards Organization, revivifying that, and turning this into something like a star owners trade group. And the role of something like that would be that it would serve as not as something like a union, but as something like a neutral forum, right? Like utilities have these, lots of kinds of companies have industry organizations whose intent is to give you a place to talk about what are your best practices, what are your shared protocols. You can spin off working groups to define particular parts of your system and so forth. This is what the star trade organization, star operators trade organization, whatever we end up wanting to call it exactly, will turn into here. The other is the Stellar Congress, which, as I've said, is kind of in an awkward place in that it's not clear what it would do. I think that's something we need to start talking about. I don't have an answer to that yet. I have some suggestions like censures or reputation model or so forth, but I think we need to start thinking about like what that could potentially do. In the interim constitution, it is proposed that it consists of active independent stars, which means people that are actually running stars and are not otherwise affiliated as a galactic senator. And the role of it would be to make recommendations for the Galactic Senate to then decide how to do. Now, we don't want more layers of bureaucracy. We don't want more overhead in getting things done with respect to how do we get the Galactic Senate, the Urbit Foundation Board, and so forth to act. But in the long run, we can see how we might want that dynamic to balance this out. All right. So that's the two organizations, and I said there were two. Yes, okay. The second Latin motto is Omnis navis estis natit. A rising tide floats all ships. So the ownership paradigm of Urbit is wonderful in that what is good for individual owners is good for Urbit as a network, and the converse tends also to be true. Right? Like owning a stake in it means that if it does better, you do better, right? We like this. We like this about it, that we own a piece of the reality of this network. So a second critical role for stars to fill is that of service provision. A while ago, I started circulating a memo called the Stella Fixa memo, the fixed stars. And part of the premise of that is what can stars do from a service provision standpoint that would provide value to operators to actually want to run stars. But like, what does this mean, right? So if every point in Urbit is a privileged peer-to-peer node, then what would stars be good at that a planet or a moon or a comet would not also be good at? And so in extremis, that's a form of address space agnosticism, saying that we're not going to differentiate points. A star just means that you have a collection of points. So you and I here likely agree that having something like a limited technical network governance in the body of the galaxies is a good thing, and that it does good things for network dynamics. The stellar analog for this is that if we set up our incentives properly, then stars as a body will also be good for network dynamics, that they will do something in the network that planets are not well equipped to do. Now, there's a number of possible integrations that stars could offer. The first place I started thinking about this is what's too heavy for a planet to what to do themselves, right? Like what are things that a star could do out of the box or with some configuration that's sort of like too much for a planet to want to do? I think there's some moderately obvious ones like email service provision, where having a static IP that is legible to other spam filters and so forth to like know like, okay, this is like a legitimate service and not a random botnet on the internet. That would help. Things like single sign-on integrations with Web 2.0 services and so forth. I think there's a role for being like CDNs for massively in-demand resources. Remote scry solves some of the problems with how do I share things. There are probably some limits on remote scry that you might say, okay, well, we're going to jump up to the star is going to provide this as a service above this. I think there's a lot of interesting financial transactions that we haven't really explored on the network. There's payment processing, including escrow. There's funding lightning channels, which could be relatively straightforwardly set up with stars as kind of the basis for that. Run your own coin mixer in an appropriate jurisdiction. Middleman brokers. I think there's an interesting role for what I'll call KYC brokers, where both parties to a transaction wish to remain anonymous to each other, but in the United States, due to the Bank Secrecy Act, someone has to know who they are, and so something like a star could act as a centralizing role for that. People played with ideas like, well, what if you get perks or event access or so forth from being sponsored by a star? since right now we have a one-to-one relationship or a many-to-one relationship of, planets are sponsored by a star, it's a little bit less clear like how that would actually work out as a good dynamic. We would either need multiple ways of having multiple sponsors or something like this down the road. But anyway, there's some interesting ideas in that vein. However, the problem with service provision is that at the end of the day, we want to replace the web, which means that it's wonderful for us to have a bridge in the middle term, but we do not want to build our house on that bridge, right? We want Web 2.0 to look like COBOL. It exists, but it's a small fraction of what happens, and everything else happens on Urbit, which means that star value capture in the medium term can rely on service provision, but it cannot in the long term. We have to build a future for stars that goes beyond that, right? It crosses the bridge. There are some interesting ramifications for community organization and securement that have been put out there. In App Workshop, I talked about something called the leak protocol. I don't think anyone ever actually ended up building it, but the idea of that is basically how do you anonymize interactions on Urbit using comments as intermediaries in a principled way. Let you build kind of a Tor-like system on top of Urbit, which is like, it's at least as clunky as Tor, but it's a gesture in this direction of can you start building darknets? Now, darknet is, as we've been conditioned to think of it as a really dirty word, right? Like the media and the government, in a sense, they like this word because it's kind of a frightening word. Like people don't have a good impulse to what is a darknet or a deep web or whatever. Certain kinds of stories have been told about it, but we have strong incentives towards privacy and sovereignty, and in fact, we have to recognize that the thing that is underlying a darknet, like the Platonic ideal of what's underlying it, is an appropriate and a wonderful thing, which is the ability to build an internally high-trust community with relative transparency without worrying about leaks to the outside world, right? So in the West, we sort of live in a globally name-spaced world where in the prisoner's dilemma that we play every day with other people, there's often more social capital to be gained by defecting on someone who is not socially compliant than there is to be gained by cooperating with them. And so this leads to kind of the muddle that we have today. But building these kinds of darknet, but secured communities is an important part of allowing us to think and act clearly. Like it's sort of like we're living in a world where everyone has a Harrison Bergeron handicap all the time, just because they aren't in an open space where they can just think and talk and sort of provisionally work through things and see what their ramifications are and decide what they want to be, right? Like every community has to define this API with modernity in a sense. Decentralized autonomous organizations received a lot of attention from about 2016 to 2021 or so. In a way, they kind of run their course. And so the premise of a decentralized autonomous organization is that you have a number of people who hold a token together, and by virtue of holding this token, it's a governance token, they are able to make decisions on what happens with the activities and treasury of the decentralized autonomous organization. I think that this is a good idea, and it's worth exploring, and the tools and modalities that have heretofore been adopted in DAOs have largely been completely lacking, and they've failed to live up to what they could be as a result of that. Now, dynamically, the founder of Urbit wrote a couple of more recent papers, one of them on what he called optimal autonomous organizations, and one on attested enclaves. And I think both of these actually map very well to using stars as the nuclei for community formation. An optimal autonomous organization, I guess I would say that WOW maybe, it's essentially an attempt to instantiate a joint stock corporation as if it were a DAO secured by cryptographic mechanisms, where you have a board, you have an executive, and you have certain kinds of hierarchical relationships within it. The nice thing about this, so one of the problems with DAOs, is that they're directly democratic. The problem with a direct democracy is that it doesn't have a signal damping mechanism that keeps it from making relatively short-term, short-sighted decisions on what's going on. One of the advantages of having things like boards or at the national level we have legislatures and so forth. One of the advantages of that when they aren't experiencing some form of regulatory capture or internal cabalization is that they act as a damping mechanism on popular will, right? And so only the clearest, highest purity signals actually make it through a multi-pass filter like that. This is what you want. And so organizing things as optimal autonomous organizations around stars, provisioning stars so that they are well equipped to set these up is one way of building towards a future that has that. I think we could do this today. Not all the tools are quite there where you want it, but I think it would be possible to build a startup that essentially operated this way now. Around a star, but actually treating it as a startup with maybe the governance token is the equivalent of stock or so forth. The other thing that Curtis Yarvin talked about was attested enclaves. And this was the description of a network in which every participant in that network was able to verify the software that everyone else on that network was running. This sounds a lot like the kind of thing you could do on Urbit. Urbit doesn't really directly do that. I mean, we're trusting that everyone's running the same runtime and basically the same hardware. So if I ask for someone's desk cache, I'm assuming that I'm getting the right desk cache. But we don't need to build Urbit as an attested enclave itself. We need to build the ability for stars or collections of stars to build their own attested enclaves, and then you can everyone who's running inside of that circle knows that certain guarantees hold about security, performance, and behavior as a result of that. All right, I got some other things. There's some other pieces of such a functional private community. I think we would by and large agree on them, so I'll put them in the text. But there's a couple of questions before I get to the what is actually the lead of my talk, which I've held off on for now. One of the questions is, why stars as opposed to anyone else? That's a good question, right? Like, why can't a bunch of planets just do this themselves? To some extent, they can, right? But we don't see, for instance, a group of 256 planets declaring themselves the Planetary Senate and implementing their own protocol for Mars, because the moment they did that, they would become dark planets roaming the waste, right? Like if you're not participating in the technical protocol, you're not part of Urbit at the end of the day. So you can't deviate from the technical protocol too far, or you're no longer compliant, and therefore you've done a hard fork on the system. Another is that stars, I think, are, if we're going to adopt an analogy, a very old analogy from Urbit, wherein galaxies were referred to as peerage, stars are naturally the gentry. And in English society, functionally what that meant, let's go back to a more pleasant image rather than the dark planet looming at us. In the English gentry, one of the roles that the gentry, in the English society, one of the roles that gentry played was essentially preserving English cultural values. So stars need to act as the natural guarantors of decentralization on Urbit. That's the role that's native to them. They're the ones who are saying, there are 2 to the 16th of us, and we need to, the network incentives need to be set up in such a way that naturally they decentralize. For instance, one way I've thought of this is that the value to operating a single star is great. The marginal value to operating more than 10 stars is much less. There's ways we could talk about how do we actually set that up. But I think we can do it. And I think this is the way to avoid decentralization theater, is we set up the incentives for stars to order the network in such a way that they're not trying to capture larger and larger pieces of it, but they can extract sufficient value, create and extract sufficient value at their own scale, that the pressures for strong re-centralization do not exist to the extent that it actually happens. All right, so it doesn't mean quadratic voting. I don't know exactly what it means. This is why I'm bringing this up today, but I think we can figure this out. So if we structure star values such that it is better expressed through not being centralized, and we motivate star owners to prefer to disperse and operate stars, then we've solved this problem, right? We have guaranteed through stars and the structure of star incentives that urbit becomes and remains decentralized. So here's the buried lead. The single biggest value add-on for stars to play in the urbit ecosystem, and the most obvious modality for value capture, value creation and value capture, is for stars to act as digital cryptographic signers. We define a meta protocol within or on top of Azimuth. I have floated talking about this to people as what I would call a layer 0 blockchain. Urbit has properties of this, and I think the other properties of this would be reasonably straightforward to set up, by which we make it so that people can build L1 blockchains with a relative minimum of effort directly on Urbit that hews to whatever protocol they want. They want proof of stake, they want proof of work, they want kinds of proof of identity that are not possible today. Urbit provides the layer 0 primitives that makes it possible for them to do that. And I think we either bake it into Azimuth or we bake it on top of Azimuth. We can figure out exactly what this meta protocol would look like. This supports secure messaging, it supports notarized documentation, it supports financial transactions, cryptocurrency or fiat, it supports reputation, it supports autonomous associations. It becomes the backstop of decentralized community. If we think of Urbit, if you're familiar with the dark forest metaphor, in brief, it's a metaphor for why don't you hear certain kinds of sounds being made in an environment? And the answer is because if you make those sounds, a predator comes and eats you. What this does is it slightly centralizes trust via stars by raising pylons in that dark forest by which to navigate. But it also means that you can use those pylons to navigate. Now you can navigate the dark forest in a way that you could not previously, because now we're actually going to be able to understand the trust structures and these things that are being set up by people to work with this. At this point, the use of a term like blockchain is probably no longer apt. We're probably starting to talk about building things that don't necessarily look like classic blockchains. I mean, you remember like 2016, 2017, when it's like Microsoft is going to build a blockchain inside of their company and they're going to run stuff on it. Which, like, in a sense, is an interesting experiment. Like, I'm glad it was tried, but I also recognize that it was also functionally meaningless to make that kind of a claim for it. But I think we're gonna start talking about doing new kinds of things. Classical proof of identity may as well follow the Bank Secrecy Act for what it requires of people to show proof of identity. Urbit, you essentially get something that looks like proof of identity for free. Now, if you want to make sure that you don't have too much centralization or whatever, we go back to what the incentives are in that regard. So the market's not yet mature for a full version of this. People could still do 51% attacks and so forth on top of this. But you could definitely build a tested enclaves for whom that's not true, right? Where you actually do have decentralization, or where the entire enclave is controlled by one person who has some sort of mechanism in place to guarantee that they're not going to play a 51% attack. There's a lot of interesting game theoretic work that's been done on trying to solve those kinds of problems, and I think we should investigate that more. Now, let's go to, all right, to sum up, galaxy star delamination, that's what I'm going to call this deviation in price between them. It's proven to be a difficult proposition for us to navigate, but we're equal to it. Like, we've done hard things in Urbit. We can do more hard things. We will have to do more hard things. But I think we can come to an adequate solution that prioritizes all parts of an equity-based address system. Equity used in its proper term of ownership as a proportion of a stake of the address space. The challenge of star valuation is it requires us to create value creation mechanisms for stars. We can do this. There's some ideas here. I'm sure you have other ideas. Let's talk about them. Let's figure out how to get them, what parts of this go into the protocol, what parts of this it makes sense to farm out to an existing startup or to another startup that's out there. There's a lot of options there. By assigning stars a complete role with out-of-the-box support for it, we're going to be able to provision this and seed this out in ways that we've not previously had, right? Like we can have a star pill that, they boo with it, and all these services and so forth are just running out of the box. There's a little bit of configuration, but it should feel fairly minimal for them. It should be straightforward. Now, it's worth hearkening back to a moment for, like, why do we care about urbit? I mean, you all have your own reasons to care about urbit, but in a sense, the reason we care is because we think there's something in decentralization. One way to put it is that we think that competitive market dynamics are more likely to bring good outcomes than a centralized planning process would do. So, but we also believe that people have the right and capacity to cultivate their own culture. Stars are the natural home for this. And we have to make it possible and legible and ready to hand for star owners to do this. Do we do this through the Star Trade Organization? Do we do this through bounties? Do we do this through the Urbit Foundation and Corda? Like, where do we do this? I don't know. That's an ongoing conversation. I want to have that conversation. Let's talk about it. Do we investigate setting up the Stellar Congress right now? Well, we investigate it, and we decide whether or not it's actually worth it. Like, is the vision for the Stellar Congress, does it actually make sense? Does it serve a differentiated enough role to do anything? And then finally, we actually need to define what I'm talking about as the layer 0 digital signing layer. If we agree that it would be a good way to attract, capture, and secure star value, let's start talking about, like, technically what would this look like? How would we build it? How would we get from here to there as we put this forward? So there's a lot to do for stars. There's a lot of future for stars. I do not believe in address space agnosticism. I don't think every point is really a comet, ultimately, which is where that leads us. I think that stars will serve a role to make Urbit what it should be. And now it's just making sure that we set up the hierarchy, the administration, and the incentives to push us in that direction. Thank you. Are we Q&Ing or am I vacating?
Do you have any Q&A? Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? Questions? Yeah.
Is there a group or a forum or somewhere we can keep up on the progress?
So right now there is the Provider Standards Organization, which is on DAWZOD, is that right? Where's Kenny? I saw it's on. Oh, there's Kenny.
Probably.
I think it's on, or DOPZOD or something. It's on a Zod. It's on a Zod start. Okay, it's DOPZOD. It's DOPZOD is what it's on. Yeah. Yes, DAWZOD would be Zod because it's a 0. So yes, DM me or Kenny with a star attestation or from a star, and we'll add it because we're only having stars or people who've been delegated as stars. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand your case for like address space agnosticism. In the example you gave, where kind of like you have all these planets who are, you don't know kind of how much they share the values with the network, and the hope for maintaining it in in a centralized way, right? But you could still use mechanism design and kind of like an incentive layer to reward kind of good like quality contributions or maintenance. So I guess I don't quite see why or any arbitrary ship shouldn't be able to provide services to a network that is providing some value.
So there is a case that can be made for address space agnosticism. I don't agree with that case, but you can make that case, and it has been and will probably continue to be made.
It seems like in the future we'll eventually get to a point where stars are sponsoring other stars. Is that going to affect like the weight of the parent stars' decisions in these organizations, or is that just like a fuzzy detail?
So when you wish to do peer discovery or routing. That's what sponsorship practically means in Azimuth terms now. So there's actually not a mechanism in Azimuth for a star to sponsor a star in the Azimuth sense. There may be ways in which we use the term sponsor in the future which would not map to that. But right now, the only way in which you would have sponsorship is if you are a star and you are subscribed to another star's desks for updates, but it's not the same thing as an Azimuth level sponsorship. I do think that there's actually, if we lean into star communities this way, then we might actually want to find a way that there's a sense in which a point can have multiple sponsors, but it would not be in the same sense in which something is sponsored on Azimuth in 2023.
So I think kind of like going off that, like the sponsorship trees and kind of where you get OTA and stuff like that, there's seems to be, and this maybe goes to the rest of the battle as well. But right now you can get your OTAs from anybody, and you don't even know that they can at least easily stop you from doing so. How do you feel about unilateral changes to that model that maybe aren't technically necessary, but that do serve some sort of forcing function to say, hey, you're getting your OTAs from your sponsor, better have a good sponsor that's not filling with day-to-day, maybe we'll start charging you something for it.
Well, this gets back to the old idea of emancipation, for instance, right? The idea that you could change, a point can change its sponsor. So hierarchically, it nests in the address space in a particular location, but it doesn't mean that that's the actual sponsor on Azimuth. And a lot of us have done processes similar to that, because you buy a point on OpenSea and the galaxy it's under is not turned on, so you have to go find a sponsor and so forth. So, but I think that, I mean, I know you've talked about like token-based gating of access to things, like you want to install something, so the parent point to which you are appealing looks at your token and says, well, you get the freeware version or you get the payware version, this sort of thing, which would be a straightforward way of setting this up, and not that far technically out of what we do right now. Thank you all.
Questions?